Welcome everybody. It's very good to see you all for this first meeting of the year. Good to see quite so many of you who have got up in the morning in the United States to join us. I was privileged to hear an earlier version of this talk in Essen, and I know you're going to have a good afternoon. Professor Eric Scherer is based in Switzerland, but he's been collecting, despite his youthful looks, for pretty well 50 years, which is quite hard to believe. And first exhibited in 1978 and collects all sorts of exotic areas. That's always intrigued him most, including French India. He is a fellow of the Royal, and he's on the board of the German Philatelic Association, and has recently become a member of the European Academy. So with that introduction, Eric, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So basically what I want to talk about today is this early period of colonization of European nations and powers of the Indian subcontinent. Yeah, so if I talk about the Indian subcontinent, I more or less talk about what later became British India, which includes today's India, which includes today's Pakistan, Bangladesh, but also includes today's Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, as it was named in these days. And just give you a little bit on the background. Simon introduced myself. I did start to collect French India, I think about 15 years ago. Basically, I was looking for a very small and easy area to collect. It's kind of a small area, but it's not an easy area to collect. So I was wrong on that part, but it's a very exciting area to collect. And it's one of those areas that many people don't even know that this existed, yeah, that there have been French colonies in India. There have been much more than French colonies in India, and we will talk about those today. And we will talk about the history of these European powers. How did they conquer India, and how was that reflected in mail and postal services? Because this is really, really an interesting story. About the timeline, I'll start, and we'll see that that's rather easy with the Portuguese arriving in India in 1498, and I pretty much end with 1816. Many people, especially also philatelists, somehow don't understand why I choose 1816, but 1816 is a political date which basically changed a lot in India. Many changes have been happening before and were military changes, but with 1816 these were also politically settled. So just a little bit about the background of today's talk. Also, I did write a book on this subject. This was done for Monaco Phil 2022. Yeah. And as you all know, Monaco Phil always has a few topics, and the topic of the 22 exhibition, one of the topics was India. So basically, Patrick Marcelis approached me and said, "Can you help me to put together a book on Indian philately, which is like a common thing that there's a book written, and it's not a catalog, it's a book, yeah." And we discussed that, and I said, yes, I can do that. And the main thing is, if you look at literature about Indian philately, you have to say it's really extensive. Yeah, there's an extensive body of books on it, on Indian philately. Yeah, so I was like saying, hey, I cannot write anything about Indian philately because everything is pretty much covered. Yeah, and by doing that, it's like something turns out that period until 1816, while different nations, European nations, were competing for dominance in India, is not really covered in the literature. And it's especially not covered in a comprehensive way in comparing what the different nations were doing. So this is basically the baseline of this talk, and this is also a reason for this book. And this is also a reason why this is not just another book on Indian philately, but it's really a book which covers something which has not been covered before in that way, just to give you a starting point. So let's go into the middle, and I really want to go through the timeline and give some of the backgrounds. We'll walk through this table of content in the talk. I will not explain it now. I will explain it once we jump into the different chapters. And let's get started. And the first thing is just to understand why did the Europeans end up in India? Yeah. So what was the reason? Yeah. And if we go back in history, we find that there's a very, very long and a rather extensive but not very well known history of Indo-European relations. If we go back, there is, for example, this battle of the Hydaspes. That's a battle recorded of Alexander the Great from Macedonia, yeah, who marched to the east, and he marched in the region which is today Pakistan, and there obviously has been a battle there. Yeah, we only know about this battle from European sources, but it's obviously that there have been contacts. Yeah, this is only in the history books. Other example I show here is that statue of Indian origin called the Pompeii Lakshmi, and this statue was found in the city of Pompeii, which, as we all know, was covered by the Vesuvio volcano in 79 before Christ, and so it was some piece of art in a private household, and it's rather interesting that the Romans had Indian artifacts at that time. So it just nobody knows how this statue ended up in what is today's Italy in the Vesuvio region, but there have been trade relations in those days. So if you continue, we basically India was kind of a provider of luxury goods, yeah, and the luxury goods that India provided mainly later Middle Ages were spices, yeah. So the spice trade was a very, very important thing, and here we see a spice trader in Nuremberg, Germany, in the 1400s. And basically this guy is selling spices from India. So we have that, and we can see this image from a spice market from today's India, and it pretty much looks the same to what this guy is selling in Nuremberg some 100 years ago. And basically this spice trade was handled by the Arabs. Yeah. And in 1453 something happened. The Turks took over Constantinople, and they took over the rule there, and basically all that land route trading between India and Europe more or less broke down. Yeah, so this is kind of the starting point where because the Europeans have been lazy before, they have been like the rich people had those spices, and I'm sure they were most happy to serve them. It was really a luxury good. It was an exotic good. But they didn't care because the Arabs did all the business, the Arabs did all the transport, and they didn't care. And basically, with the fall of Constantinople, the Europeans were forced into action. And this is something that we can see with this time and with closing down the way to the east. Yeah, there was this struggle finding a way to the east. And as we all know, also the US, or what is the Americas, were discovered by Columbus, who was trying to find a way to India. Yeah, so this is an example of this one of these very first famous trips of Vasco da Gama, who traveled to India around the southern Cape of Africa. It was a very long trip. It took usually 1.5 to 2 years. It was highly dependent on the weather, on the monsoon season and all that. But basically, the Europeans started to go to India. Yeah. And one of the questions that we should think about is okay, in this time, shortly around 1500, the Portuguese went to India, but we all know that actually there was a second nation, the Spanish. And why didn't the Spanish end up in India? And there's a good solution on that. Somehow I missed it here. Is that Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494, yeah, that basically divided the hemispheres or the spheres of interest between the Portuguese and the Spanish. Yeah. And as we look at that, we clearly find that India was in the Portuguese hemisphere. And this is really one of the major reasons why at that time it was the Portuguese that first arrived 1498 in India. So just go back and have a look at that. This is a map of the settlements, and we can see, and we will have a look at that now. We had the Portuguese. The next one that did arrive were the Dutch. When it was the English, which were still English at that time, they became British shortly after when Scotland joined the Union. It was the Danish, it was the French, and it was legally the Austrians, but of course not really the Austrians, the Belgians, which didn't name themselves in those days Belgians, but it was what is nowadays called what was at these days called the Austrian Netherlands, and what is today Belgium. And as you can see from this map, pretty much these 6 nations from Europe built up different trading posts along all coastal lines of India and Sri Lanka. So the starting point were the Portuguese, and until the mid-18th century, basically mail services were restricted to carrier mail carried on boats between the different settlements in India back to the respective home country. Yeah, so these are just written letters. You can usually, if you are like, I cannot read this, but the experts can read it. Yeah, and you know, okay, this, for example, is a letter from Lisbon from the king himself, King João III of Portugal, to his official in India, Alfonso de Mexia, who was in Cochin at that time. Yeah, so basically we have those letters, and mail services were available like as a side business, more or less, through the ships. Most of those ships were company ships. Yeah, in the case of Portuguese, it's different. Portugal was the only nation which was like down there as a nation. If we talk about the French, the English, the Dutch, also the Austrians, yeah, and even the Danish, we always talk about companies. We are not talking about countries, yeah. So it was company ships which went down, and they carried these letters back and forth, more or less only available to the officials of the respective country, or in the case of the Portuguese, of the nation. So the next nation which did arrive were the Dutch, and the Dutch had a great impact on India for a certain time, yeah, also on Ceylon or Sri Lanka, yeah, but the Dutch were more or less those which disappeared quite early, because the Dutch did concentrate on settling what is today Indonesia, and which was the Netherlands Indies in those days. Yeah. So for the Dutch, India always has been kind of a hub. Yeah. Mainly to change ships and get food and all that stuff. But still, for a certain period, the Dutch were very present in India. And for example, this is a letter written by Commander Isaac van Dielen, who has been governor of the Dutch possessions in India in those days. And in those days also, if we go back and look at the map of the different settlements, the settlements did tend to change the ownership. Yeah. So for example, in those days, the Dutch also raided some of the French settlements and took over French settlements and vice versa. Things like that happened. The next one that did arrive were the English. As I said, in those days, they were still English, not British. Yeah. And basically, in the early times, the English were just one of those nations. Yeah. By now, we have the Portuguese, we have the Dutch, and we have the English. And pretty much shortly after that, the Danish arrived. Yeah. Which is rather interesting because probably Denmark is one of a considered rather small country, not really a colonial power. Danish are probably the exots in the whole business. What is very interesting about the Danish is that they did kind of an outsourcing, yeah, that the Danish basically did the outsourcing of all the development of their colony to a German Protestant denomination called Frankische Stiftungen, yeah, which is in the region of nowadays East Germany or the eastern part of Germany, and these guys pretty much did that. One of the interesting things is in the course of research for this book, we found correspondence of about 2,000 letters which have been going back and forth between Danish India and actually through Denmark to Germany to these Frankische Stiftungen. And they still have about 2,000 letters in their archives, which never have been analyzed before we did the first analysis for our book. The last ones actually to arrive were the French. Not really the last ones, the Austrian came later, but the last big ones were the French. And the French developed their presence in India rather fast. Yeah. So at a certain point of time, the French presence in India was kind of a predominant presence in India. Yeah. So we had the British, which were rather dominant. We had the French, which were predominant. We had the Dutch, who already moved on to the Netherlands, Indies. We had the Danish/Germans, who mainly tried to pray to God and to be missionaries, but did not really invest into trading. Yeah. So actually the German ministers were the first ones to print a Bible in Tamil language. So they had a little bit of a different occupation. The last ones that did arrive were the Austrians, Belgians, or as you would say, the people from the Austrian Netherlands. Pretty much, if you go into the history of the Netherlands and the Austrian Netherlands, it's like it has been a big country which was split around that time into a Catholic South and a Protestant North. The Protestant North is what is today the Netherlands, or what was the Dutch, yeah, and the Catholic South is what is today Belgium. The Belgian presence in India only lasted a couple of years. Yeah, so by this time, 1722, India was pretty much occupied already by European powers, and especially the French and the British managed to keep the Austrians out. So this is what was happening, and during all that period, we find these kind of letters. These are very, very rare letters. Most of them are rather unique. Of course, we have those letters from the Danish settlements where we have 2,000 letters, but they are in museum archives. But if you look at letters in private hands, it's only a few letters, and these all have been carried by hand on ships back and forth, and mail services or carrier services were available only to officials. So by the mid of the 18th century, in Europe, there started the 7-Year War. Yeah, and I think, as most people know, this 7-Year War was the first worldwide war. Yeah, and it's a very, very interesting war, also philatelically, because it's also probably the first war where we have extensive philatelic material, and basically this war commenced between mainly the French and the English, and of course a lot of other European powers like the Prussians. But if you talk about a worldwide war, it was the French against the British in Europe, in North America, and in India. Yeah, and it's rather interesting if you look at that. This is a little bit of how this whole thing was divided. Yeah, and how the allies were placed. Yeah. And you can see that it was a worldwide war by the participation of the allies. These images don't show the war theaters. Yeah, the war theaters were mainly limited to Central Europe, Northern America, and India. Yeah, with some exceptions. We find rather interesting philatelic material about this war. For example, we have this correspondence of a French officer who has been writing very, very interesting letters. This letter, for example, is written in the area of Chandernagore, which is the Bengal settlement of the French, and he tells a lot about these conflicts and what was happening. Yeah, ultimately, the 7-Year War, and it has different names in the different regions. In India, it's mainly called the Carnatic Wars. Yeah, they found the climax in the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Yeah, and basically a British officer called Clive won that battle against the French, and the French always connected to the locals, same as they did in the North America. They did fight together with American Indians, and here they did fight together with Indian Indians. Yeah, and basically by that time, the dominance of the British in India was settled after the Battle of Plassey. Yeah, it was not finished, but it somehow was clarified. Yeah, of course, France was very weakened as an international player by the French Revolution. Yeah, which pretty much took place pretty much after that, and I guess it's for me, it's still until today very hard to understand how you could have a guillotine in Paris, and what did the French in Chandernagore and Pondicherry in the French settlements did do at that time. Yeah, that context did exist. You can see with this letter. This is a letter from Chandernagore in Bengal, written to France, and it has all the shipment marks. This went through mail service already. We have markings, we have rates, yeah, and we have the leftovers of a French revolutionary censorship committee seal. Yeah, so this is kind of a very interesting situation, and it shows how things were happening. Finally, it all climaxed into the Napoleonic Wars. This was kind of a final climax, and to a certain degree, the Napoleonic Wars were also a little bit of a follow-up of the 7-Year War, and the Napoleonic War did reach out again, like the 7-Year War, also to India and to North America. And for this example, this is a letter by a British officer who is anchoring on a ship, Sarah Christina, in the Bay of Pondicherry, and he gives an account on what is happening there. Yeah, so also here we see that, and we see again just by looking at his text here that pretty much all the nations were involved to a certain extent. Yeah, so this was kind of a climax at that, and that did decide the dominance part. Yeah, because with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it was settled. The British did won, and by this also their dominance in India was settled. In parallel, and this is very, very important because it happened in parallel between the 7-Year War and the Napoleonic Wars, the British built up a de facto postal monopoly in India. Yeah, so we have to think about what was actually where in India, and as we understood as until now, the different nations, they did not care about any mail within India. Yeah, they only had their carrier shipped mail letters between their settlements on the coast and their homeland. Yeah, and pretty much the domestic mail was left to let's say domestic services, more or less unorganized, but in India for centuries we had those so-called dog runners. This is an image from the 19th century, but I guess also in the 18th and the 17th century they must have looked very similar, and basically these guys, they were carrying mail messages but also light goods. Yeah, and they connected all over India, and at a certain point the British said, okay, this is not the right way to do it. We have to establish a public and domestic mail service. Yeah, so two things happened at once. First of all, mail services were established within the Indian continent, of course not as dense as the stock runner system was doing, but to a certain extent between the 3 British districts and the main towers and towns and settlements, mail service were established, and which is very important, mail services were open to public. Yeah, in the course of the years, more and more settlers came to India, private merchants, all kinds of people, doctors, teachers, private household assistants. Everybody was coming to India, and it was not purely the different companies' employees anymore. And so in 1766, Warren Hastings, he was at that time the general governor of the Bengal province for the British East India Company. He did establish the first postal services in India. So this is kind of a starting date for postal services. And if you go to Europe and you go outside of Britain, yeah, and look for public mail services in the mid-18th century, you will find that virtually nothing did exist. Yeah, so if we say, okay, on a European continent it was turn and taxes, in Britain it was whatever was the Royal Mail in those days, and in India these were the 3 centers of mail services in the mid-18th century. So the British started to build up those mail services. And one thing that they did in the course of the war is that they built up postal services also on the crowns that were French and Danish. Yeah, they never built up postal services in Portuguese India, except a very small period. But on the French soil and the Danish Indian soil, they started to open post offices. And this is a very nice example of a mail written from Pondicherry, which was French India, to Chandanagore, which again was French India, but this was all carried out by British Indian or British East India Company mail services. Yeah, and it's rather interesting because it shows everything. We have a letter written in French language. We have a hand-struck stamp marking in obviously English language, and we have a marking for the postal rate, which is 9 fanon, yeah, which has been the French currency. Of course, 1 fanon was 1 anna, yeah. So it was not an independent currency, but it's rather interesting how that mix was happening, yeah. And so this happened pretty much in this intermediate period. The Battle of Plassey was won. The Europeans were occupied with the French Revolution, and Napoleon wasn't there yet. Yeah, in that time, the British built up the first postal services in all over India, but they also opened post offices in French India and Danish India. They didn't open post office in Portuguese India, and they didn't open post offices in Dutch India and Austrian India because Dutch and Austrian India did not exist anymore at that time. So with the end of the Napoleonic War, there has been the Treaty of Paris. Yeah, we know that there has been the Vienna Congress, but the treaty which was dealing with the overseas settlements of the French was the Treaty of Paris that was in 1815. And basically, the British were always very clever. And they said, hey, leave the French, leave them a balcony in India. Yeah. So basically, and they did the same to the Danish, leave them a balcony. Yeah. So they left the French and the Danish with just a very, very few, more or less middle-sized settlements. Yeah. In the case of French India, it was Pondicherry, Chandanagore, Karikal, Mahe, and Yannaon. In the case of the Danish, was mainly Trankebar. And basically they said, hey guys, keep that. You can be happy. You can say you have settlements in India. You can hiss your flag. Yeah. You can parade with your little army. Yeah. You'll be happy. But we do everything else. Yeah. And one part of that was that the British kept the postal monopoly in those days. Yeah. And the British were rather clever. And they, for example, had a treaty with the French and also the Danish that allowed officials from the French India and Danish India to use the British Indian mail service for free. Yeah. So this is one of the really, really interesting letters. Two of them exist by, in this case, Comte Dupay, who has been the new governor of French India, and he traveled from Europe to Pondicherry in 1816. Yeah, and here in this case, he was still on British soil and was writing his letters. And because he was the governor of French India, he had a post-free privilege on the British Indian mail services. Yeah, same thing applied to the governor of Danish India. The good thing is, of course, the British, they could read the letters. Yeah, and so they had a good chance that they knew everything that was happening. We have to remember, in these days, the British just defeated Napoleon twice. Yeah, and it was not so that they had complete trust in the French. So pretty much with 1816, these things were settled. Yeah, Britain was the dominant power on the Indian subcontinent. Britain had built up infrastructure. One key part of that infrastructure was at that time already a very extensive mail service network, yeah, with lots of post offices and a rather diversified postal service domestically and internationally. And by 1816, we pretty much move in the better known part of the Indian philatelic history. Just to give that outlook, the French did not introduce own mail services until the mid-19th century. The Portuguese did not introduce stamps for a very long time. And basically, they started to build up their own mail service in the mid-19th century. And we all know those beautiful classical letters. There has been a book on Portuguese India mail just published at the RPSL by Rivers Brothers last year. Beautiful book. We have all that, but pretty much that was very, very, very minimal compared to what the British had been doing. Yeah, and of course, it's a very interesting field to look at the interaction, for example, in French India between French postal services by 1850 and later, and British postal services. But this is kind of a different chapter, which probably can be covered in another talk. Yeah, so just to clarify, India always has been an innovative postal region. We had these postage eggs from British postage eggs, the King's Post and those things, 1814, 1815, and 1819. We had the Anglo-French Postal Convention of 1836 and some other conventions later, which basically ensured a worldwide network of maritime mail. We had the India Post Office Act of 1837, which introduced those hand-struck stamps, which was a huge step of automation. And we have the first stamps in India, still fairly early in a worldwide context, in 1852 and 1854. So everybody who is interested in further reading, the book is still available at the Musée des Timbres in Monte Carlo. You get it for 80 euros, which includes the postage all around the world. So for you guys who probably live in Australia or the US, it's a rather good deal. And here is the link. You can find the order form. You can pay by credit card. So I'm pretty much at the end, and I'm happy to take questions or comments.
It was a fascinating tale, Eric, and I was particularly intrigued, actually, that you discovered a new Danish archive in the course of doing the book. And I mean, are there other archives out there that are unexplored, and is there more to do?
It's like I think on the British and the French side, yeah, I think things are rather well known. Yeah, it's like these are well-known collections. The French side probably is a little bit less known compared to the British. Patrick Marcelis has been doing extensive research in the archives at Ghent and Antwerp on the Austrians and the Belgians. Yeah, Very difficult is the Dutch, yeah, because India was never really important for the Dutch, yeah. And before the book, there was virtually no letters known from the Danish part. But if you look at the history, it was obvious you had all these missionaries that went through the Danish settlements, and usually the missionaries are very well organized, and they all belong to this Franke organization. And so when we went to Halle to look at the archives, it turns out they have 2,000 letters. And what is most interesting, I have not been showing that, the letters which have been written from Halle, Germany to Trankebar in Danish India were mostly pastoral letters by Mr. Franke himself, yeah. And those letters were translated in Tamil, and they were inscribed on palm tree sheets, yeah. And these are also still available in Halle, yeah. So they have a huge collection of these palm tree sheets, yeah, which is quite an interesting thing, yeah. I guess nobody can read it anymore, yeah, at least not the people in Halle, not me, but it's very interesting.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. I can see we've got one question up there from APRA Tim. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Eric. Fantastic talk. I have your book and I refer to it quite often. Just want to ask a little bit of around the Danish settlements that you mentioned, right? So as you mentioned, if I can say so, that the context of Danish India per se was mostly around missionary activities, as you mentioned, right? And to that extent, when the ex-territorial post offices were established in Danish India, like Frederiksnagor, that's Serampore, and Trankebar, as we call it. So there have been instances where there were daily newspaper periodicals where they used to spread the gospel and what have you, the trial of Trankebar. You covered all of that in your book. So the question is, why are Danish settlement letters so difficult to find? Because if one goes and finds that those and we are talking in 1826 to 1830s, around that time, right?
Yeah.
And the circulation of those newspapers went all the way about to maybe 30,000 a year. So I would expect that there would be at least a lot of mails that must have been sent. Whereas if you my survey is, I don't think that there are more than 20 or 30 odd newspaper wrappers that exist today, right? I mean, that's being pretty liberalist.
I think one of the main reasons is that the Danish settlements, basically the Danish did not really care about those settlements, yeah. If you look into history, at that time there was a union between Denmark and Norway. It was a very difficult time, lots of changes in Denmark. So Danish India remained pro forma Danish, but in reality it was outsourced to Protestant missionaries from Germany. Yeah, and these guys, they mainly did write their letters and send out all their printed material among the networks of those missionary circles, bishops, and churches. Yeah, so most of that material is still in official archives within the church. Yeah, so for example, when Danish India also was sold to the British, yeah, all the missionary work was taken over by a London society, which basically continued with more or less also the same people. Just it was not Danish anymore; it was British, yeah. And so I personally think, especially around Danish India, there's much more material in say official archives than from the other countries. Yeah, if you look into the history, The French as well as the British did not like what the Danish were doing. Yeah, they actually said they are generating turmoil. Yeah, because especially the British said, we don't need to introduce a Christian God to the Indians. Yeah, they have their own gods, and we don't want to generate extra turmoil. And it happened quite often that German and Danish ministers were actually arrested by the British for the missionary work. Yeah, because the British said they generate turmoil. Yeah, so the letters, especially from the British and the French, were mainly, the origins are mainly from merchants. Yeah. And in the beginning, of course, it was company officials. But when if you look, for example, the Verlet letters from Chandernagore, these were private merchant families. And some of them have extensive mail, and all that mail archives, I would say, was plundered by philatelists for the last 100 years. Yeah. So philatelists have not been able to plunder the Halle archives. Yeah. Fortunately, probably, yeah, probably unfortunately, this is open to discussion. But if you look at the Fairley family archive, for example, one of the Fairley family was a lover to the French king, so she was considered the Marilyn Monroe of the French Revolution. Yeah, and the family was the biggest indigo dealers. But all those letters, and these are hundreds of letters, yeah, they are everywhere. Yeah, philatelics, small museums, collectors, archivarians, post historians, everywhere, but they are splitted all over. Yeah, and this is something we see quite a lot. And Danish India was not a commercial hotspot; it was a religious hotspot.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic explanation. And what you mentioned, which is very, very interesting, is the point that you made around the British not quite favorable towards the Danish mission of spreading religion. I mean, perhaps this is not a fair question, but have you come across any document, like any contents in any letters that speaks about this particular thing specifically, that the British are
Yes,
perhaps?
there's tons of letters, actually, for example, from Mr. Ziegenbalg, who was the head missionary and who introduced the first print. Mr. Ziegenbalg came from Halle. He was a Protestant minister, and he imported the very first printing press to India. Yeah, and the British didn't like that at all. They were scared of a printing press. Yeah, and Ziegenbalg started printing his documents, mainly religious documents, in the end also the Bible, in Tamil language, which was even more scary to the British. Yeah. So it's like nowadays, I think if I would think about the British governor sitting in Madras and talking about Ziegenbalg, they said he is a leftist terrorist. Yeah. and Ziegenbalg went several times to prison. And we looked at some of the letters that he wrote and which are still in the Halle archive about his imprisonment. Gosh. Yeah, so it's there. You can read that. You can go to Halle and you can read those letters. Yeah, I had the help of a local philatelist who had looked at about 500 letters. If you're good in German, you can still read them. They are fairly good readable. And most of these letters are nowadays also available online. Yeah, the quality is not the best, so we had a lot of reproductions done extra for the book, but this is a very well run archive. Yeah, and the people in Halle they would be more than happy to receive somebody from India looking at the archives.
I have to learn German, brush up my German first, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Great talk.
Oh. Thank you. I can't see any more hands raised. Are there any more questions on the talk? So thank you very much indeed. I found that absolutely fascinating, and it's and now that I know the book is post-free, I might get it a bit earlier than the trip to Monaco at the end of this year. Because that's always the bit that puts me off with some of these very heavy books, that the postage cost is going to be truly prohibitive. So thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating. You will get your certificate in due course. Well, Mark, we got to the stage of, if you had the carefully prepared earlier certificate, it would be wonderful to show it, and then we could bring the recording part of the session to an end and open it up to a less formal chat.
Yes, Simon, thank you. I will do that.
Eric, it's my pleasure to present it. As I say, the hard copy will be in the post to you. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot.
To accept our formal certificate of appreciation.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mark. I think we can now draw the formal part of the meeting to a close and open up to any more general chat. It's very good to see Peter Coburn with us this afternoon. So that's good news. So if you want to unmute yourselves and start off in an orderly fashion.
Okay, so thanks a lot from my side. I will send you the final version of the slides, so you can also share them or put them on your webpage for download. That's no problem. Yeah, but I did some more small changes today, so I will send you a final version later tonight or tomorrow morning.
Right.
Thank you for an excellent presentation, and good night from McLean, Virginia.
Well, thank you for joining us. Yeah.
Good night. Yes.
Good.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. That was absolutely superb. Yeah, and fascinating as well. I learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I actually was lucky enough to have watched your presentation at Essen, and this time as well, and I see the differences and appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you that you liked it.